My older brother was training for a triathlon as well. So we just said, look, come for a swim. We all used to swim a lot when we were younger. And I lent him my wetsuit. He went for a swim in the lake. And he said for the next 24 hours, it was just like that swim. It was like the fog of depression just lifted.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't know whether it was the cold water, the exercise, being outdoors, probably a mixture of those three gave him this temporary relief from his depression and his mental health.
Right.
But then the clouds started, descending back again. But it sparked in him an interest in to get back into outdoor swimming or into swimming in general. And so a few months later, he signed up to do a 10-kilometer swim in Loch Lomond.
Okay.
And as he did and completed that, it was during that he made a promise to himself that his kind of ultimate dream was to swim from one end of Loch Lomond to the other.
We are here today with Neil Gyte, who is an epic swimmer, just finished an incredible swim challenge in Loch Lomond, and he is a metabolic health advocate. Neil, awesome to meet you.
Thank you very much, Marnie. Wonderful to meet you too, and looking forward to a great conversation.
Today's episode is brought to you by Cyfox Health and Ketone IQ. Let's get into it.
And obviously it took him a few years to get there. He's got 2 young kids and so forth. And so he decided to do the swim. He then invited me to join him, having done a decent amount of ultra endurance things. So I decided to join him. And I then added the additional twist of the 0 calorie, really aligned to my mission, which is to help 1 billion plus people become metabolically healthy. As I realized that actually our mitochondria and metabolic health is the root cause of the majority of chronic diseases, the majority of which are preventable and reversible. And so I'm now on a mission to try and help people realize this, because it's still very, very underutilized, understood.
There's actually a scientist who's like a huge advocate of that philosophy, Dr. Dan Plews. He is a triathlon coach. You know Dan? He's been
Yes,
on
I
the
do,
podcast
yes.
before, and he actually did Kona that way with no carbs, only on like ketones and fat as fuel, and he was the fastest in his age group. It's pretty incredible. I mean, you really have to train your body, and it's not for everyone. I mean, it is a good, if you can do it, it's amazing, I think. I mean, and everyone's different, but I think just training your body to burn fat as fuel.
So I wholeheartedly agree. And this is where the purpose of the swim really was a metabolic demonstration. So it's not to recommend that everybody should do this, but it was really to, create, as Nick Norwitz calls it, it's legit bait of how can you swim for 12 hours, burn, 10,000 calories without eating anything? It's not possible. It is possible. But back to your point, I think the important thing is people understand that our bodies are designed to utilize both of these fuel sources.
So you completed this incredible challenge on September 19th with your brother Dave, where you swam across Loch Lomond. It was a 22-mile swim, which you did in 11 hours and 55 minutes. So what sort of inspired you to pick that lake, and why there, and what overall inspired the whole challenge?
So yes, 22 miles swimming, 11 hours, 55 minutes. I think the key thing is I also did it totally fasted. So 0 calories, just water and electrolytes. And so the kind of why, that's one part of it, is really to demonstrate that sugar and carbohydrates are not needed for athletic endeavor. And actually the over-reliance on them, the population in general is one of the biggest drivers of chronic disease, which kills 70% of people, worldwide. And as I realized this, I really wanted to do something a little bit crazy that made people sit up and think and realize that our amazing mitochondria have got these 2 fuel sources, main fuel sources that they can use, and people should be utilizing both of them. And so that was really the reason why I decided to do it fasted, to demonstrate our ability to use fat as fuel. The actual swim itself and how that came to be is somewhat related, quite interesting. So my younger brother, I did it with my younger brother about 5 years ago. He was really struggling with depression and mental health challenges. We were on a family holiday in the Lake District in England, and we managed to convince him just to go for a swim. At the time, I was training for an Ironman And if you over rely on sugar and carbohydrates, your body forgets how to use the fat
Right.
burning side of things. And I think one of the most famous, I would say, examples of this back to the triathlon world is Sami Inkinen, who was one of the founders of Trulia, who then went on to co-found Virta Health. And
Okay.
he, I think in 2011, he did Kona and he, did sub 9 hours, which back then, was pretty impressive. But after that, he got some blood tests and he realized that he was pre-diabetic and he just couldn't fathom the two. How is it I'm pre-diabetic, yet I can do a sub 9 hour triathlon? Because the predominant fuel source, sugar and carbohydrates, and the more that you put into your body, the more metabolic dysfunction happens and the more you start to develop pre-diabetes and a lot of these chronic diseases. And so really the principle is, and I believe back to if you low carb, and if you want to then fuel for the work required, at least you've got that metabolic flexibility to do both. But what I
Right.
really wanted was the translation into real life. People who are taking, a granola bar or having a gel or a sugary drink before they go and do a 30-minute workout at the gym. And it's this kind of prevailing paradigm that our bodies are going to stop working if you stop consuming sugar and carbohydrates. And clearly, that's not the case. We're actually designed to run without any carbohydrates. That's the way our biology is designed. So it's really to raise awareness, but a little
Mm-hmm.
bit like Dan and some of the others, my view is if you work from a low carb base and then if you tactically add in what you feel you need, you've got that flexibility.
And you have to just train your body to do that. Like I know a lot of people that, it's like anything. Like you have to train your body to take in 80, 100 grams of carbs per hour, the same way you would train your body to not take in those carbs. So yeah.
Yeah, correct. And it's an interesting point actually. So this was an interesting experience for me to fully adapt. Previously, I
Yeah.
had done more, fueling for the work required. And so it did take me 3 months for my
Okay.
muscles to truly adapt. And so if you want to truly adapt, you do take a step backwards. But then once you do, and I felt this throughout my training swims and the swim itself, it's
Mm-hmm.
then once you have that adaptation, it's like you are an electric car but you have unlimited range because you're just tapping into your fat as a fuel source. And so once you do, you just have this absolute constant source of energy, which comes from a really pure place because it is actually a much purer burning energy source. You get a lot less of the byproducts that glucose metabolism
Right.
gives
Like
you.
stomach issues and gut issues.
I mean, even more, yeah. So there's that for sure. And again, you watch Kona over the weekend, you see Christian Blumenfeld, projectile vomiting everywhere because he's trying to, shove
Drink
120 grams of
Yeah.
carbohydrates down his throat. And so there's that. But also, what people don't understand is at the mitochondria levels. So your mitochondria, actually, if you overwhelm them with too much, glucose and or fructose, they will shut down and stop working. And yes, you can train your gut to do that, but irrespective, you are just overwhelming them.
Yeah.
And back to Sami Inkinen, I think is a great example of this, is you can do this and you can do an Ironman, but in the background, you are a slow boiling frog that is turning up that heat rapidly through
Yes.
high carbohydrates and lots of sugar, and you will develop one of the chronic diseases sooner rather than later. And I think people.
That's so interesting because it's like, when you're an athlete, you're like doing all these sports to be healthy and competitive. And I think about it a lot, but I think like, oh, because I'm an athlete, I can have like all these carbs. And I'm not taking in as many carbs as a lot of people because I just don't, I can't, that's just me. I'm also not competing for like world championships. So I'm not that crazy, but see I could see, like, in retrospect and thinking about it, big picture, if you're training 8 months a year and you're using these gels and carbs and things in your training, it's a lot of sugar because you have to practice.
Yeah. So this is where, for me, when you look at things from an evolutionary lens, it becomes crystal clear. So our blood can only tolerate 1 teaspoon of sugar glucose at any one point in time in our 6 liters of blood, right? 1 teaspoon. Any more than that is toxic to our blood. And so
Right.
we have these, hormones to then get the sugar out of our blood and put them somewhere. And the muscles is our kind of main glucose sync. But from an evolutionary perspective, we were designed that way. Our biology and systems are so complicated, they hadn't really evolved that much in the last 50,000 years. 1,000 years ago, there were no carbohydrates really. And so you understand our bodies have got amazing adaptive physiology. We can adapt to anything. It's why we survive as humans, but we're just not designed to have consistently that load of carbohydrates. Yes, we can tolerate them, but it
Right.
causes mitochondrial dysfunction, which promotes more energy storage rather than utilization. And the trap that most athletes get into is, yeah, while I'm doing lots of exercise, I can do these endeavors. But
Totally.
if you actually track your blood markers and see what's happening to your fasting insulin over time, you will see that creeping up and creeping up and creeping up. And once you have that, then it's the breeding ground for all of these chronic diseases to develop somewhere in the body.
So along the way, like while you have been, have you always been on this sort of, fat as fuel metabolic therapy fueling, or was it, were you doing that during triathlon, or did you just do it during the swim?
Yeah, good question. So not always been that way. So 10 years ago, if we'd have been speaking, I was 260 pounds and fast tracked to I most likely had pre-diabetes at the time, and I was fast tracked to an early grave. I became a father. It was my daughter's christening where I couldn't even play a game of football for 2 minutes without having to sit down and take a breather. That was my, painful moment to change because I wanted to be a fun and active father. So that sent me on my own health journey, which initially was just, per the kind of the guidance at the time, which was, exercise more, eat less and eat
Right.
healthier. And then I just started to run. I started to cycle. I got back into swimming and I signed up for my first sprint triathlon. And it was actually that first sprint triathlon that I was in the same paradigm mindset that the majority of people are. And I went down to the shop where I bought my bike and I was asking their advice for a sprint triathlon. What should I fuel with? I see everybody eating, these gels.
Right.
And the gentleman at the bike shop pointed me and he said, our triathlon coach is over there having a coffee. Go and speak to him. He will give you some advice. And the coach at the time, who's still my coach now, amazing guy called Luke Matthews, he was very much a low carb, natural advocate at the time. And that's why he said, with all the greatest respect, you're doing a sprint triathlon, you've got more than enough in your body. You don't need to eat anything. But if you go longer, then actually you don't need a lot of these, sugars and gels and so forth. And so I then kind of went on my own journey of longer and longer half Ironman to Ironman. And
Right.
through that, with his guidance, I was always very much low carb. I actually did my first, I think, two half Ironmans totally keto, similar as you mentioned. Then after that, I started adding for, kind of the work required because I did feel that it did give me a performance and recovery edge. But I've always erred on the side of low carb, but I've also tried every single diet under the sun because
Right.
the kind of the secondary story of this was my own health journey. And I spent 20 years working in the tech world, majority at Google, helping to build Google Maps, Google Earth, and kind of the business and platform that developers use. But it was the impact of chronic disease on family and loved ones. I had, many different people developing autoimmune diseases, developing bipolar, depression, heart disease, cancer. And it was a very close family member's stage 4 cancer diagnosis last year that got me digging into this. And as I realized that the same thing that I was using the knowledge to help fuel my athletic endeavor actually translated and is the root cause and cure for majority of these chronic diseases. And as I realized that, I decided to leave the world of tech and path a new mission to help 1 billion+ people to become metabolically healthy, because the realization that every single person on this planet is either going to be directly impacted or through a family or loved one by one of these tragic chronic diseases, and the vast majority are preventable and reversible.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit of a
It's
long answer to your
amazing. No, but
question,
I
but
mean, it's,
that's kind of been
yeah.
my journey over the last 10 years.
So that's been over the last 10 years. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think it's, it's not something like new for people to hear. It's just like putting it into action is so hard. And also, like, I think it is true that as an athlete, you kind of like overlook what you're doing, what you're eating. I think it's coming back around. right? Like for the last few years, everyone's been talking about, because this fat as fuel and, you know, how these things affect our metabolism has been, I feel like, a big topic for the last decade, at least in my world, like just metabolic health in general. But then I feel like athletes have been kind of like left out of that conversation because of the word health, right? Because they're healthy, because they're exercising. And, but I think that, you know, and there's been this huge movement for athletes to really look at how many carbs they're taking in per hour and for endurance events. And I'm the same way. But I also use ketones. So I'm kind of like, and I also don't try to get like 100 grams of carbs in. I'm on 60 if I'm running, or I'm on like, if I'm on the bike, it's probably more like, it's probably 60 per hour also. Like I don't overdo it, but I also, like I said, use ketones. So it's like exogenous ketones. So I'm not doing what you're doing, like fasted, but I think it's very interesting. I think, yeah. What
Yeah.
do you have to say about that? Like that was a long answer that I could totally delete, but I was just sharing my story.
No, look, I think it's interesting, and it's back to, for me, the most important thing is how do you meet people where they are and land the kind of the knowledge of why they need to change and then give them practical products
Right.
that help them to change. And so I think exogenous ketones, I have mixed views on. I think they're great
Okay.
because they are creating awareness for people. Oh, there's this other fuel source that I can use to balance with my sugar and carbohydrates. The challenge is if you just rely on exogenous ketones, you're never putting your body in the state where it actually is generating those ketones itself, which it can do. So anybody can do and use that. And I do think that there is a place for them, but I think the important thing is how can people change their metabolism so they can naturally utilize both
Get
fuel
into that
sources,
ketosis state. Yeah.
and then, if for true athletic performance, you want to dial it up and add a little bit more carbohydrates and some exogenous ketones, if you do that on top of a solid foundation, which is
Yeah.
metabolic flexibility, then you're building on top of a really stable foundation. If you just continually rely on those, you're not really
Yeah.
fundamentally focusing on the root cause, which is your mitochondria and how they produce energy. But if it's a tool to help get you there, I'm all for practical tools because, as
Yeah.
you said earlier, it's hard.
Yeah, I think that's a great metabolic flexibility is like a great way to look at it, right? Because you have to train, you train for the bike, you train for the run. If you're doing the swim, you train for the swim, like all those things. So you have to train your like metabolic flexibility. But I do think, yeah, I do think it's pretty cool that you did that you swam fasted for 22 hours. What was it like? Like, what did you feel like during the swim?
Good question. So generally, I mean, we had firstly amazing weather. The weather gods were incredibly kind to us. So from that perspective, we had amazing conditions. It was an amazing day. I was hoping that I would just feel great throughout the whole day and the whole swim.
Mm-hmm.
The training swims, when I'd done a long, like 30-kilometer, 9.5 hour training swim, that training, and I did that one totally fasted, I felt stronger and stronger throughout the swim. And it was like I was the electric car that had unlimited range, and I could just go through the gears and go through the gears. On swim challenge day, and actually there's some interesting kind of science and blood tests that demonstrate what was happening behind the scenes. Was I really enjoyed the first 2-3 hours, but I only had one gear the whole day. I could never kind of nudge out of that one gear the
Mm.
whole day. And the reason I believe behind that, because I didn't change my diet, I was low carb, throughout all of the training and up to the swim because I wanted to keep things consistent. But I'd spent 6 days in the UK, very sleep deprived. So I flew overnight, didn't sleep. And then I just really struggled for sleeping in different beds, different environments.
Mm.
And I also partnered with Levels, who provided a CGM, Cyfox Health, who provided some blood test kits that I did, a baseline a few weeks ahead. I then did a blood test the morning of the swim. Actually, no, 6 days before the swim, the morning of the swim, the morning after the swim, and then about 2 weeks afterwards to get a baseline and understand what was happening during the swim.
Right.
What staggered me about those results is my fasting insulin levels. So 6 days prior to the swim, when I did my test here in Houston, they were down at 2, which is,
Wow. That's
very,
low.
very good.
Yeah.
in the space of, which is kind of what you would expect for somebody on a very low carbohydrate, diet and very insulin sensitive. But what I found amazing was still keeping that same low carb diet. 6 days later, they were at 8.5 because of just the stress that the
I
body
was gonna
goes
say like
through.
cortisol, right?
Yeah, so it's back to, and for me, it was less the stress around the swim. It was just more pure lack of sleep. And so,
Mm,
metabolic health, food is a big part of it, but sleep is a big part of it as well. So back to why I really think that I couldn't get out of that kind of second gear on challenge day. I really think it was because just my biology wasn't truly in homeostasis because it started to
right.
put in place some of those defense mechanisms that protect you when your body's saying, I'm not quite feeling, you know, balanced and aligned. And so I really think that was, aside from that, the swim day was great. We had a lot of fun, but it ended up being, I would say, just a little bit more of a grind than that I would have thought it,
Yeah.
when that I hoped it would have been.
I think that's an interesting observation. I was going to ask you if you had a CGM that you were able to see because I mean, and the blood. I want to talk about that too because we were introduced right through SciFox Health,
Yeah.
and they kind of highlighted you as someone who was doing something really cool using their at-home blood test kits, which I've done a couple of them, and I've been taking my blood like on the regular for years, like every 3-4 months, just training and everything else. I think that information is just so invaluable that you get. And I was curious to see if you had a CGM because that's how you can see like what is happening with your blood in real time.
Yeah, so the CGM results actually were probably one of the most fascinating of the swim, in that I thought that they would be very relatively boring and that they would, start at the baseline. You
Right.
always get a little spike when you start exercise because the body, because blood sugar and glucose is toxic in the blood and inside the cells, it will always look to utilize that first. So you get a little spike, but when the body realizes there's not a huge availability of glucose, you then switch to burn fat ultimately through ketones. So I thought it would a little bump, and then it would just, drop down to gluconeogenesis, and then it would just stay flat for the rest of the swim. That's what I thought. Largely, that's what happened. But what I found really fascinating was every time I stopped, my body basically down-regulated glucose. So even the second 6 hours of the swim, when I was swimming, my body would lock into 55 milligrams per deciliter glucose, which is very low. Some people
Yeah,
would
that's
say
like my sleeping
dangerously.
glucose.
Some people would say dangerously low, but I mean, clearly I swam for 12
Is
hours, absolutely fine. My view, not dangerously low. But when we would stop, so every hour we stopped, for me, I just took on water and electrolytes. It would then drop down to 40, and then I would start swimming again, and it would upregulate to 55, and then it would drop down to 40. So every time we stopped, it down regulated, which I found fascinating. Firstly, either the body was down regulating. I'm still looking into the exact reasons why. Another element could be that obviously your muscles produce lactate as you swim. Lactate can be converted into glucose through gluconeogenesis. So it could
oh
be
interesting.
as you're at rest, you've got less lactate, therefore the body just has less available resources. But still, what was fascinating to me is it most likely could switch and use other things, but it didn't feel it needed to. And so that was actually really fascinating for me. One, the levels which I got to, but the fact that it dropped down to 40, I felt absolutely fine, throughout, no problems at all. So the CGM data was actually really, really
And it's
eye-opening.
is levels real time? It's real time, yeah, because you're
Yeah,
saying
it's
yeah.
real time. So yeah,
Do you have an
you
app?
get it every
Yeah.
5 minutes. Yeah, and you get it through the app. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, I used to use another company that was great. It was also like levels. So I think that's really interesting. And then what were you looking at with SciFox Health in your blood? Like, because that's obviously not, you know,
Yeah. So the purpose of doing the blood test was really to see two things. One, what was happening cardiometabolically, and were there any significant shifts really, as a result of the swim, but also then hormones. So one of the main things that I was very conscious about, and you see this a lot in the literature, is that the impact of fasting that can have specifically on, testosterone and your hormone imbalance. And some of the backstory to this is I actually had a kind of a case of chronically low testosterone right back at the start of this year. So as I was leaving the world of tech and had this new mission, it was such a pure driven mission that I would wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning. I would try to get back to sleep. I know how important sleep is, but I would
Right.
try everything. I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep. So I would then get up and I would read, I would research, I would, do some things. I thought this would last 2 or 3 days and then my body would realize it wasn't sustainable. It lasted for 2.5 months.
Wow.
And at the same time, I was training for Boston. So I was also, you know, dramatically overtraining. Long story short, I started struggling on some of my longer runs, and I thought it was a fuel issue. So I actually started adding in more carbohydrates. And that actually things got worse. I then got my blood tested and my testosterone was down at, total testosterone was down at 100. I think my free testosterone was down at something crazy like
So were you
13.
overtraining or what was, yeah.
So it was a combination of overtraining with just lack of sleep. So the
Sleep is
body
so important. It's a game
across.
changer.
So I think for everybody listening,
Yeah.
what to learn across both of these things is actually, sleep. Yeah, and it was the sleep, because sleep is when your body repairs and replenishes itself. It's when, testosterone largely gets reproduced. So my kind of yeah, my I was burning through, I would say, my testosterone, relying way too much on, cortisol, some of the other energy systems the body has, which are useful for short term, but once you start to, you know, it's not even rely on those, the body just does. Yeah, sleep is so, so, so important. So I was I was obviously conscious trying to bring my testosterone levels back up whilst training for a 12-hour swim fasted. Maybe wasn't the smartest of ideas, but we'd already committed to the swim at the time. So that was why I was really interested to look at the impact on, hormones, specifically testosterone as well.
Yeah.
And so actually what came back from the blood results was also interesting in that, so previously you had Phil on from SciFox. I know you've had Michael, you've had a bunch of the others on. So we certainly thought that triglycerides, because a lot of the studies show that triglycerides drop significantly when, you're doing more kind of, fasted workouts. So that was certainly one marker we thought that would drop significantly, and potentially some of the hormones, specifically testosterone. But actually, what came out, yeah, is that triglycerides actually they did drop, but not dramatically, not significantly.
Interesting.
I think that is because most of the studies where that has happened were in, I would say, athletes that were low carb, but had been from a relatively short period of time, so didn't have that deep adaptation that I have, where, my muscles, every muscle in my body is now adapted and wired really to use fat and ketones as a fuel source. So I think
Right.
then because of that, then it probably didn't impact my triglycerides as much. And similarly on the testosterone, actually, what was really interesting with the testosterone is it did drop, I would say, somewhat significantly from basically 380 down to 247 in from the day of the swim to the day after. And so initially I looked at that and I was like, okay, that's a pretty good big drop. That's quite concerning. But then I did my follow-up blood test 8 days later, and it was up at 528, which is the highest reading that I've had in the last 9 months, for my
So totally
testosterone
sounds like it
levels.
was overtraining. I mean,
So,
maybe you don't feel like you're overtraining, but it's just like training takes its toll on your body and it's like super stressful. So I don't know.
so, so
As a
it's certainly,
doctor,
so
no, I'm kidding.
yes. So yeah, it certainly does. But I think what was pleasing, and as I was monitoring my testosterone, I would say, throughout the swim build up, I managed to get it from the 100 up into the 300s for sure.
Yeah.
But what was pleasing was even a week after, doing that, then, I was back to the highest kind of level I could. So that for me demonstrated, at least for the N of one for
Yeah.
me, that I didn't feel that the swim actually had any detrimental impact on my body. I think because I was so fat adapted. Obviously, my C-reactive protein shot through the roof, as you would expect after, swimming for 12 hours. But again, a week later, it was back down at, baseline, just over one. And so, yeah, so that's where the blood results were also, I would say, the biggest thing was the fasting insulin across that window of the swim, because that for me really, I was
That's
just
interesting.
amazed
Yeah.
that on low carb that I can go from a fasting insulin of 2 up to almost 8.5 in the space of 6 days just by not sleeping. And so, which is why sleep is one of the superpowers that it is so, so important to try and dial in as much as you can.
So would you do another swim? Like, do you have another challenge plan? Like, what's kind of next for you?
Good question. So definitely yes, another challenge planned. Exactly what that challenge is, I don't know. I promised my wife and daughter that after spending too many weekends of, face down in the swimming pool, that I would obviously take a couple of months to spend more time with them and still continue with strength and other work. So probably the start of next year, I will figure out another challenge. And I think it'll be similar in nature in terms of a metabolic demonstration exactly what that is, if it's swim, if it's run, if it's bike, triathlon, something else, or even something a little bit different. I'm not entirely sure yet. So I'm open to suggestions if anyone's got some
What
crazy suggestions.
So what was the like this swim was nice. I mean, how did you pick that lake? I mean, you said your brother kind of wanted to swim there, but I mean, I'm not a big swimmer, so I'm just kind of was it choppy? Was it flat? Like you had support, you had sponsors, like how did it all come together and work?
Yeah, so the Lake Wadi was chosen, as I said earlier, because of my brother. And it's one of the most beautiful, picturesque lakes in Scotland. So that was kind of why we chose there. We did have support in terms of we had a boat crew with us at all times. My older brother he was on the boat helping out with the boat crew because safety was paramount. We obviously didn't want to jeopardize anything around safety. The weather conditions were absolutely amazing. I was mentally prepared for it to be absolutely gale force winds and chucking it down with rain because you have to be mentally
Right.
prepared for the
Yeah.
worst. So I was prepared for that, but an area of high pressure came over Scotland and it was glass flat first thing in the morning. And so probably my favorite parts were that first hour where it was just glass flat. You're feeling fresh, swimming, with my brother, a swim that meant so much to him and to both of us for the reasons why we were doing it. And a beautiful orange sunrise, over the
That's so nice.
mountains it was absolutely serene. So I think that, and obviously, and finishing it. So just getting to the end and getting to the end with my brother as well. So he completed it as well, even though his training didn't quite kind of go to plan. And the water was pretty cold. So it was 12 degrees Celsius, which is about 54 Fahrenheit. So we did swim with wetsuits. But when we did our practice swim, my brother was actually still struggling with the cold with a wetsuit. So he ended up actually wearing two wetsuits.
Okay.
But we had to work through a bunch of those things. So just getting to the end, giving him a hug, and then stopping my watch and seeing that I burnt, like 9,632 calories just taking water and electrolytes was just, yeah, that's pretty amazing that the human body can do that. And whilst you conceptually know that it's possible, obviously, to get to the end and realize that was pretty special.
That's amazing. What electrolytes did you use? And did you also measure your like sweat loss and hydration levels as well?
Yeah, so I didn't measure sweat loss and hydration levels. Would love to. It just ended up being practically possible. The other thing that I would love to have measured but wasn't practically possible was do a DEXA scan before and
Oh
afterwards
yeah.
because, so much of the concern out there is that your body starts to break down muscle, instead of fat. And I am highly confident that in myself that wasn't the case whatsoever. I do think if you're not fat adapted, then I think that probably could be the case because if that kind of, the pipes in the body aren't primed to easily switch to utilize fat as a fuel source, then I do think the body could start eating into muscle. I personally, for myself, I don't think that was the case, but I would love
Yeah.
to have
You would
measured
love to
that.
measure it. So maybe
I
for
would
the
love
next
to,
one.
yeah. So,
Yeah,
so yeah,
so
exactly. The next one, there just wasn't any DEXA scan facilities up in the west coast of Scotland.
I know, and Scotland, I mean it's so that's such a beautiful place and lake to do this. Do you have any other like lakes that you want to conquer or swims?
Yeah, good question. So not really, and I would say the swimming. So it was certainly like the longest swim that I've ever done by far. So prior to
Yeah,
this, the longest swim I'd ever done was part of, Ironman
right,
training. So I probably maybe would tap out at maybe 5 kilometers. So and that's why this swim was an interesting one because previously all my endurance had been around leg endurance and strength
right.
because you mostly use your legs for running and cycling. So I did have to do a lot of strength work on, upper body. And so, yeah, so I haven't actually thought, but definitely there were some other swims that I would love to do. I think there's some amazing lakes. Tahoe is one. We used to live in California, so doing some kind of swim around Tahoe, that could be interesting. I think there's a few other lakes. Open sea, I'll give a minute. I watched Jaws way too young as a kid, and
Oh,
so
probably.
I
Yeah.
and I have swum in seas. I actually did Busselton, Western Australia Ironman. And I think I did it in 2019, and the year before that was the year that I actually had to abandon the swim halfway through because there was a shark sighting. And so then going to swim that the year after was definitely cathartic and maybe
I mean, at
some
least
good
they
mental
caught
work
it
being
in
done.
ahead of time, right? Like at least you guys weren't out there, or maybe they were. I don't remember that story, but I just like, yeah, no,
Yeah. Then my strategy for the Busselton swim was, basically as fast as I can, and
right,
always be on the inside. So always make sure that there's somebody else outside.
right. I like
But yeah,
totally. I have. I don't really do a lot of like open water sea swims when I do triathlon. It's usually like a bay, which could have a shark, but highly unlikely. I'm more like terrified of jellyfish, which are first disgusting and then also like sting. So those are my, you know, were
yes,
there a
and
lot of
having
jellyfish? No, not
So,
really.
so thankfully, no jellyfish, no loch monsters. See,
Yeah,
Loch Ness, which is one of the other famous lochs in Scotland,
yeah.
but we didn't
Okay.
we didn't see any equivalent monsters. So
All
thankfully, it
right.
was a no jellyfish. But I remember as I was doing the training for it, the amazing Naiad film and the Naiad documentary
Yeah.
on Netflix came out. I don't know if you've watched.
I've seen it. I love it. I would love to talk to her. She's amazing. That's just like such an incredible journey that she's been on. Yeah.
So absolutely incredible. So any of the listeners watching, I think just watch Naiad the movie and the documentary for me actually was better than the movie. And back to
Yeah.
what prompted this conversation, the jellyfish, when you see she gets stung by, Portuguese man of war,
Right. Which
and
is
you
like,
actually see in real time her processing through the excruciating pain, but then she carries on swimming for another 12, 15 hours afterwards. I was doing this thinking, and all of this was, is great kind of mental preparation as I was preparing for the torrential rain and all of the crazy weather conditions that I thought there might be yeah, you look at what she did, absolutely unbelievable. And that's inspiration that you can always do so much more than your mind and body think that you can. And she is, yeah, you're right, absolutely amazing, inspirational, incredible.
definitely, I definitely go there when I'm out like running or doing triathlon and I feel like I'm suffering. And then I think about other people who've done like such incredible things and have powered through, or even like as small as, I get into onto the swim and I'm like, immediately I think I'm drowning, I can't swim, but I can bang out like 3,000 yards like in the pool, no problem, 3 times a week. Put me in the water, open water, and it's over. Like my mind takes over. It's a whole psychological exercise that takes a lot of energy for me to
Yeah.
overcome. So I just wonder, like, you know, like back to your brother and doing the swim and how it helped him with his depression. Like this kind of challenge mentally can really kind of like push you and also like paralyze you.
It really can, and I think that's a really great point, and something that I've come to realize through my athletic endeavor, which is you've got to find the balance between adaptive stress and chronic stress. And
Right.
to your point, and a lot of people that do struggle with swimming, especially when, Ironmans or triathlons used to be everybody start at the same time, and
Yeah.
you would have to dive in, and you would have, 1,000 people kicking in the face, and heart rate would go through the roof and
Right.
the water, and a lot of people literally would get panic attacks through doing that. And so I think on race day it's important, but also through training, because I think what's another thing that I've learned, I used to when I was much younger, I would brute force all of my training. To your point, there's worse people out there, but also I think being in tune with your body and knowing which days are the days to really double down and push versus which days, if you're not feeling it, to take it easier. I think that
Yeah,
that growth as an athlete is really important because your biology just can't be on it every single day, but knowing to be honest with yourself where truly your biology is not there to support if you've got a really hard workout and to say, you know
right,
what, I'm gonna let me come back tomorrow or let me reschedule this next week.
right.
That takes, I think, yeah, it takes a lot
You have to
of
be an
knowing
adult,
yourself and
a very grown adult, I like to say. It's an adult decision. You have to be like definitely, I think, in your 40s to be able to. I don't know about how old you are, but like, I think it takes a lot to get. I have never made smart decisions like that until like later in my triathlon life. I just like, I would go out and have a hard ride and I would be, yeah, or swim. So it takes a lot to get to make smart decisions.
I agree. I was exactly the same. I think it's a mixture of your biology is a lot more forgiving on you the earlier years. I think that's one part of it. It gets less
Yeah.
forgiving the older you get.
Yeah.
The
Totally.
other part, to your point, is just more experience and knowing yourself as well. And I think for me, one of the other things that I truly realized through, so I did Ironman, and then after COVID, I really focused on marathons because I
Right.
hated running. Running was my worst discipline by far. But I actually then chased after the fastest marathon time I could do during the COVID period, and really fell in love with running throughout that process. But as you do that, my previous mantra was just run more and more and more and more and more. But actually
Right.
through that, I realized that less is more. And if you really nail those like really specific sessions, the amount of gains that you can get
Huge.
is huge, but you have to be in the right biological and mental state to do that, to really push yourself to that limit. And you can't do it every week, every day. You really have to build it into your training.
Right.
So that really taught me that less can be more, and you don't have to go and chase. Previous marathon time was like 3:45, and I ended up doing a 2:45 on actually less training than I did for the 3:45. I think I maxed out like 85 kilometers a week.
Okay.
And I initially thought I would, generally you have to do, 120, 130, 140 kilometers
Yeah.
a week. And so that was a really interesting learning experience for me through that, which is quality trumps quantity.
Did you work with the same coach? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I did actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's always been Luke, the same coach,
He
throughout
sounds
that. And that's
amazing.
so
He sounds like a
honestly,
great coach.
so
Yeah.
he runs, yeah, Iconics coaching based out in Dubai, but he coaches athletes around the world. And yeah, a lot of what I've learned, which is why the other piece of it, I know you have a lot of athletes listening who already will have coaches, and I was never, a top end age group athlete, but one of the best investments that I ever made was deciding to have a coach
Yeah.
because
It's a,
the
yeah.
amount that you learn through that, but also just not having to think or second guess kind of what to do, especially as you're starting out. But I've learned so much from Luke, and a lot of the quality over quantity was him setting my program and saying, no, you don't need to do crazy amounts. We can do this on less. But when I put a quality session in there for you, you need to go into that rested and you need to really nail it.
Right. Like your key sessions. How many marathons have you done now?
So I've probably done maybe I would say eight marathons in total. So not a crazy number, but yeah, probably eight in total.
And then what about triathlon?
So triathlon, I've done two full Ironmans. I think I've done maybe five half Ironmans and a bunch of other, yeah, sprints and Olympics.
And this is all over the last decade. Like you just like one day decided like I've got to get healthy and
Yeah, so I never intended to get into any of it. It was back to I just wanted to get healthy. I was living
fit.
in Dubai
Yeah.
at the time, healthy and fit. I was living in Dubai at the time. I was traveling all over the world pretty much every week. And as much as I hated running, the only thing that I could consistently be able to do wherever I was in the world was run. And so I spent 6 months waking up every morning and having a debate with myself to try and kick myself. I just said, just do 20 minutes in the morning. That's all you need to do. So no matter where you are, get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I would wake up at 6 o'clock and I would,
Hmm.
want to go back to sleep. I would be tired, but then I would remember the promise I made, to my daughter, and then I would be instantly out of bed. So it started off just, I wouldn't even call it running at the time. I would call it just moving,
I'm
fast
kidding.
walking, whatever it was. And then I just decided to buy a bike and I started to get a bit more into cycling. And then we had a pool in the community area where we lived, and I did a lot of swimming when I was younger. And that was actually one of the most humbling things. We swam pretty competitively when we were younger. And so there was me thinking, well, I can just get into the pool and I'm sure I'll be able to swim like I used to swim. And honestly, I must have done less than 100 meters and I was flat out absolutely exhausted. And it was one of the most humbling, experiences of
The
being
pool
able,
is definitely shows you who you are. Like,
it
it can be
it
rough.
it really does. And it's one of the other things I would just, highlight, because I know you have a really interesting mix of people who listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
And obviously, a lot are athletes or based athletes, but a lot of people, when I talk about the swim, say I could never do that. And I have to remind them that 10 years ago, like I couldn't have foreseen doing anything. And to get back to answering your question, for me, it was just as I started to do those, I thought, oh, why don't I sign up for a triathlon? So I just signed up for, a sprint triathlon, which is, super short. I did that. I loved it. I did another one, and then I went for an Olympic. And you
Yeah.
just kind
It's
of get on this
contagious. Yeah.
slippery slope, which is contagious. But I also remember when I did my first half Ironman, and I completed that, and I remember thinking, God, these guys that do a full Ironman are absolutely crazy. I don't see how I could do, that again. And, I just thought they were absolutely crazy. And then I did my second half Ironman. And after I did the second one, I was like, yeah, maybe I should give a full one a try. And it's back to the kind of the NIAD conversation that we had, which is you can always do a lot more than you think you can. Have you got the right reason and motivation, and can you prioritize the time invested, to take that on? So anybody can do and achieve anything that they want. You just need to have the right motivation and then make the time to put in the consistent work day in, day out to then work towards that goal.
Yeah. I mean, I think I find that, like, for me, I just did this swim challenge for the month of October where my challenge for myself, like, I didn't win anything. It was just for me because I had to get to the pool. I couldn't run. I sprained my ankle. I wasn't really cycling because I just did a triathlon and I kind of had to stop that too. But I promised myself I would do it. So what I did was, because I only am motivated by like a challenge typically or a race, I don't know what I said to myself, like, come on, like, it's like this mean self-talk, but I just said, like, you gotta like get to the pool and swim. Like, that is the only thing you can do right now, and you have a pool accessible to you. Like, don't be lame. And so I said I'm gonna swim 3 times a week. I wanted to do 6,000 a week, which is like not a lot, It's I got in the pool. I was like, oh God, this sucks. Like, it was not easy, but I did it. I mean, I kind of had to, like, I only did 4,000 this week, but I'm counting today as, part of the week. So,
Yeah.
but I did it and I did it. And you know what? It wasn't fun, but like, I'm going to keep it going because that was the idea, to like get into the habit of going to the pool 3 times a week.
Yeah.
So I can start training now again.
So, well, so congrats on,
Thanks.
I would say, on all of that. But it's back to, and I was the
Yeah.
same, with running. I literally hated running until I'd invested enough to get over the hump of being better at it. And then once you're better at it, it
Yeah.
then becomes a more of a virtuous circle than the vicious circle. And so that's the challenge, is how do you, and I love the challenge, and because I think that's the way to do it. And a lot of people only focus on the strengths and the things that they love, which I did initially.
Right.
I would always train massively for the swim because that was my strength, and I would do enough on the bike, and I wouldn't really focus on the run, even though the run is the most important, in a triathlon, until I was similar to you. I was forced to, because
You have to.
COVID took
Yeah.
away swimming and COVID took away cycling. And I'm so thankful for that, because honestly, that truly changed my, I don't know, I went from hating running to being okay with it to
Right.
enjoying it.
Yeah.
But that for me went from enjoyment truly to love, where running for the last 4 or 5 years became my favorite of all of them. I love running more than cycling, more than swimming. And so, but it took me many years of investment to get there. So
Yeah, you
you
can
can
do
learn
it.
to love, you can learn to love swimming,
Yeah,
Marnie.
I don't not love it. I feel like I'm somewhere in between. Like I really do like going to the pool and once I'm in, and I'm swimming because there is something super meditative about it. And I mean, it's the only time I'm probably not on my phone checking my messages for like 1 hour. I mean, even when I go out for a run, like I'll stop, I'll check my messages, or, it's just so ridiculous. Or I'll have music on, or if I'm out on a bike, like usually, I'm obviously not listening to music, but like it's just swimming is different. And I think if you can just, like, for anyone listening, and I know I have a lot of triathletes that listen, like, and even if you're not like a super athlete, like swimming is a great workout because it's non-impact on your body and you can go any pace you want, and it's just like challenging to get to the pool, to get into the pool. But I think once you're in, and that's why I picked the number 2000, because I just felt like once I'm in, I might as well do 2000. It's a little bit over a mile, and so I feel like I got something done.
Yeah, and that's also often part of it is, yeah, the
You have
longer
to
you're in
trick
there, if
yourself.
you get
Yeah.
into the zone, actually, the more
Yeah.
you can, once you get into that kind of sweet spot zone, then, and if you can use it as meditative, and that's where I find, and it was weird, one of the weirdest things, not the weirdest things, but throughout the swim was, so I always, a little bit like, training for any ultra endurance or long distance, doing kind of 80% of what you need to do on the day
Right.
about a month ahead is a pretty good yardstick. So yeah, I went to do the 30-kilometer pool swim because I live in Houston,
Right.
Texas as well. So no open water swimming, no cold water. I didn't have any of that. And to your point, that was, I went down got to the swimming pool at 6:30 in the morning, and I got home at 5:30 at night, and just literally face down doing laps in the pool all day. But once the mind gets into that meditative kind of flow state within that, which is also where, having done carb fueled and more fasted ketone, but I also think natural exogenous ketones can get you there. But because the brain absolutely loves running on ketones, once
Yeah.
you get into that mental meditative state, it's honestly, it's amazing. You can solve, the biggest problems,
Yeah.
headaches that you have.
Yeah.
You can work through things. Your mind just kind of opens up, and you get into this kind of different, brain state. And so, yeah, if you can push past the kind of discomfort and get into more of a flow rhythm, no matter what you're doing, running,
Yeah.
cycling,
Running,
swimming,
cycling, swimming. Yeah.
then I find that, yeah, incredibly meditative.
And now, I mean, all this time you're working at Google. When did you go off to work at RX Sugar? So all this time you're working at Google. When did you go over to and also, what is like one of the biggest lessons that you take from endurance sports to being successful in business?
Great question. So it was at the start of this year that I first made the decision to leave Google and leave tech, and my new mission to help 1 billion+ people become metabolic healthy. So that kind of vision was born at the start of this year. But as I was doing that, I had no real knowledge of exactly how. I just had this pure North Star mission and wanted things to align to that. As I then looked at the pie chart of metabolic health and the forcing function of 1 billion people, which is, of course, a little bit ridiculous, but for
You got to set
exactly
big
this reason,
goals. Yeah.
you've got to set big goals. And it forced me to truly look at how do I impact 1 billion people? And as I looked at the pie chart of metabolic health, there were loads of amazing, and I came from the tech world. I was initially drawn to tech, but there were loads of amazing companies like Cyfox, like Levels Health. There's just a huge amount of innovation in the digital space. But when you look at the metabolic health pie chart, food, ultra processed food, and sugar is the biggest contributor of metabolic dysfunction in these chronic diseases. And it's just very underserved in terms of actual solutions. It truly is. And at the same time, I went to the Metabolic Health Summit in Florida in January. And as I was there, I've been reading all of these amazing books by Dr. Richard Johnson, Dr. Ben Bickman, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, and soaking up all of their knowledge about metabolic health. And I see them on stage with talking about this rare natural sugar called allulose, which has a lot of metabolic health benefits. And I had already programmed myself to be, done with sugar. I understand the role that it plays in the body, which is actually as a survival mechanism, not really, for anything else.
Yeah.
And so I'd already made peace with sugar, and then I hear these guys talking about this sugar which could be healthy for you. So I was kind of confused, interested, between. So
Yeah.
I then connected with RX Sugar. I bought some of their products and I tested myself and was just blown away by the results that this kind of rare natural sugar called allulose, which is not actually absorbed by the body, is metabolized very different, can decrease your postprandial glucose and insulin. There's randomized controlled trials you can link in the show notes that people
Yeah.
can look at. So it can help lower your blood sugar or help manage your blood sugar. It can naturally stimulate GLP-1, which is the satiety hormone in the body. It can increase fat oxidation and it can reduce inflammation, and all from this 0-calorie rare natural sugar allulose. And so taking a step back and thinking, well, how do I help 1 billion+ people to become metabolically healthy? The sugar and sweetener industry is a 120 billion global industry. If
Right.
we could replace all of that with allulose, I think we could put a huge dent in the amount of chronic disease that is on the planet. So I then connected with Steve Hanley, incredible kind of mission-driven founder that truly is certainly more passionate than me than solving for sugar. Just well, and not that I'm not passionate, it just speaks to how passionate he is. And so
Yeah.
it was in April that I then joined RX Sugar. And so I kind of have I would say two areas that both point in the same direction. So one is awareness around metabolic health, of which I have my website, and the swim challenges kind of dovetail into the awareness, and then practical products that can impact billions. And that's where I think the more practical products, back to the conversation that we had
Yeah.
around exogenous ketones, I see, allulose in a similar way. It can be a tool that really can help meet people where they are. You can
I
still
like
have
that.
sweet things. We've got these amazing chocolate bars that you can just replace in, but over time that helps, reset your metabolic health and your metabolism. And so you can
Yeah. I mean,
default.
sugar is a drug, so your body is addicted to it. It's like heroin, so your body's addicted to it. Right now, like I'm eating sugar. There's no way I can start my day and not have it like in like a creamer, right? I mean, I know I'm saying like there is a way, but like this is just how it goes. And once you have that creamer, it's over. Like then your body craves sugar till the night. I mean, I don't really. That's the only sugar I have though, because I'm like, I mean, not the only like literal sugar where there's sugar in it, right? But obviously carbs have sugar and other things I eat throughout the day. But um, there was a time when I didn't have sugar at all. I did that, and it was amazing, and I felt great. And I recognize that, like, to get back there, like, you can't have the creamer because it's like it's a serious drug. You've got to cut it out altogether. But yeah,
So the final last thing I'll maybe leave you with, which
yeah,
was one of the things that truly blew my mind, which is yes, sugar has that impact, and sugar is one molecule glucose and one molecule fructose. And really, it's the fructose that drives the mitochondrial damage and also triggers off that dopamine feedback loop that
right,
makes you wanting more, because it's the body's survival mechanism to actually store fat. What is absolutely amazing is even if you don't consume any sugar, your body can create its own fructose internally, which is part of our survival mechanism and pathway. And what things trigger that off? Alcohol, excess carbohydrates, excess blood glucose. Your body then
right,
takes that glucose, converts it to fructose specifically to damage your mitochondria and promote energy utilization. And too much salt can do the same and can dehydration. And
yeah,
all of that is built around this kind of survival mechanism, which our body, again, our biology, 50,000 years old, times of food scarcity. These are all these signals that say, there's energy availability, store as much as you can, or I sense a threat, store as much as you can, because storing fat has saved us as a species. But in the current modern world, food is literally 2 3 hours away around every corner. So
yeah.
it's this chronic activation of this fructose pathway in the body that sugar and carbohydrates can do, which is actually reinforcing that pathway and creating the foundation for all of the chronic diseases.
And that's why it takes a lot to get away from it. a lot.
and
But you
that's
can do
what,
it. I
yeah.
mean, I did it. And you did it. So, it's just you have to be strong. Like you have to use your athletic mind to
So
get past it.
you
Yeah.
you absolutely do. And then your final question, I think, well, yeah,
Yes.
was kind of,
What are the
yeah, what have I?
parallels? Like, what do you take from your endurance sports? Because it seems like you have like a deep experience and realm of like doing that. Like, how do you bring like the lessons from the endurance sports that you do back into your like day to day? Whether it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think the first thing is really setting, kind of crazy goals. A little bit back to the billion metabolically healthy. The same in athletic, I think. If you set yourself a crazy goal that you're not quite sure if it's achievable, but you've got the right motivation to do so, then you will figure out a way to that. And it's the journey of how you figure out how to overcome that that I think is the same for both, right? You've got to take a
Yeah.
step back, look at the landscape. You've got to have a plan, but you've also got to be prepared to adapt and evolve as you go along, dealing with injuries, looking at the different things. I just think that overall landscape I use in career and business as well as athletic endeavor. The second one, which I would say, which is back to being, which I learned through experience, which is more the ability to be flexible and adaptable. And so you can think, oh, I've got the best plan in the world. I've built this training plan for my, whatever 24-week build for this Ironman. Right, I'm just going to execute that exactly as is. Things happen, family situations happen. You've got to trust yourself, and I think it's back to the accountability that you mentioned. If you've got those kind of promises to yourself and know where you need to keep those promises, the rest of it, listen to yourself, listen to your body, but the true signals of your body, because your body can send you a lot of fake signals. And I think it's the same in the business world. You've got to see where the energy is pulling you, see where,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you need to push rocks uphill, but it's much more fun when you're catching tailwinds in different places. And so I think that kind of that is I find a really interesting parallel between the two, and comes, I think, through a little bit of just learning through the process of learning who you are. And I've learned so much of who I am through becoming an athlete that now helps me in the business world, but also vice versa. I think you can learn a lot in the business world that also helps you in an athlete, and the two are ultimately very similar templates. You've just got a different goal and objective in the end.
That's awesome. This has been so much fun. I could still talk for like at least another half hour, but I know we have to wrap up. So, well, Neil, this has been so much fun. I really enjoyed talking to you. I cannot wait for your next adventure and challenge. Like, are you still raising money for this one? Like, you were fundraising, right? You were like, or can people
Yes, so we
still,
were
what's your
also.
website that people can go check you out and all you do?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So for the swim, yes, we're still fundraising. So we were raising awareness for really metabolic therapy and chronic disease charities. So if you go to 0-2-lomond.com, we're still taking donations. And there's a lot of information there on the website around, kind of the why behind the swims. Certainly that's one place. I've got another website, which is 1bmh.org. And I can send you these to
Yep,
add
we'll put it
in
in
the
the
show
show notes.
notes.
Yeah.
So that's my 1 billion metabolically healthy kind of mission website, which just has very basic explanation of what metabolic health is, why it's important, and then really just links to a whole bunch of different tools that people can start where they want, if it's nutrition, if it's sleep, if it's exercise, if it's stress management, if it's toxins. So for people to start their journey. And then LinkedIn is probably the best place to connect with me socially. So if you just search for Neil Gyte on LinkedIn, and obviously RX Sugar, you can go to rxsugar.com and have a look at the allulose products that we create to help, yeah, reset that sugar carb pathway in the body and
Yeah.
meet you where they are.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. This is great.